Hello, and welcome back to It's a Very Exciting Time, a podcast by a UFO nerd and his tolerant friend. My name is Scott, and I've been fascinated by the phenomenon my whole life.
And my name is Chuck. I'm an aerospace nerd and a tolerant friend.
We started this podcast because since 2017, there have been shocking revelations. From news of secret Pentagon programs to confirmed Navy video of astonishing craft. In a nutshell, now that the government has admitted that UFOs are real.
Or at least they will if the Schumer amendment passes.
It raises a natural question. If UFOs are real, what else? Suddenly, some of these other parts of the phenomenon that seemed unlikely are pulled into the realm of the possible.
And they may still be unlikely, but even if it's new science and not aliens...
Woo, woo. It's a very exciting time.
Yeah. So I wanted to start out by thanking our Patreons because while our monthly costs are very low, I am pleased to say that as of today, a third of our total expenses are now officially paid by supporters.
Fantastic. Thank you, supporters.
Yeah.
Oh, man. What is that, like $10?
Yeah, that's about right. We've officially crossed into the two-figure salary.
Ooh, double digits.
Exactly. So I was thinking about this morning. I used to think that like $1 on Patreon didn't help creators that much, but now that I'm on the other side, I'm realizing how much it does. And
yeah,
$1 a month is currently 8% of our total revenue.
You can make a difference.
You can make a huge difference. So anyways, if you do want to, patreon.com/veryexcitingtime. We appreciate it.
Yep. And you can find our show notes at veryexcitingtime.com.
Yeah.
All right. So Chuck.
Scott.
Well, I guess actually, listeners, I want to apologize for the gap. We try really hard to do the show every 2 weeks. But 2 weeks ago, I had a really nasty fall in the shower and completely destroyed my back. And last week I called Chuck up and I said, I can't do it, man. And I was almost ready to do it because I had muscle relaxers and stuff. I was able to sit at my desk, but
which would have been
sat down.
Interesting episode.
It would have been, yeah. I would have been saying all kinds of shit.
Yeah.
But I sat down and looked at the news, and basically, everything that was happening that would have been worth talking about was like in this really like indeterminate state. And we'll talk about it in a minute, but Schumer's UAP Disclosure Amendment, which is part of the NDAA, is one of the things they're actively debating right now. And a week ago, it looked really, really grim. Things look a lot better today, but like a week ago, I'm in a lot of pain. I'm looking at my notes. I'm demoralized. I was like, I'm not up for recording. So I've got some updates for you today about the Schumer amendment. But I want to emphasize, like, this is a rapidly evolving situation. Like in just 1 week, it's changed. By the time you listen to this, it may have already changed,
It's almost like, we interrupt this program for some breaking news.
This is an actively developing situation.
Stay tuned for updates. Channel 7. I don't know. What channel would it
be? Channel 51, obviously.
That's perfect. I love it.
So we've talked about the UAP Disclosure Amendment before, but just quick recap for anyone who's new. This was introduced by Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer. He worked on this in close lockstep with the White House. This wasn't like, we've talked a lot about Burchett and Luna being kind of like junior representatives who kind of like see conspiracies everywhere and are trying to get stuff done. That ain't Schumer. Schumer's one of the gang of eight. He's old school. He's been here for a long time. He is not risking his reputation and his legacy on UFOs for no reason or on alarm. The bill, in a nutshell, will create a JFK-style review board with the goal of declassifying and disclosing all the government records about UFOs.
It's still just crazy that, like, even a couple years ago, we weren't talking about UAP, and now we've got bills that involve the word UAP and disclosure in
Yeah.
like official things like the
Oh, it's
NDAA.
absolutely wild. Yeah.
Yeah.
It kind of breaks my brain every time. Um,
Yeah, right.
so yeah, the Senate version of the NDAA, which included Schumer's amendment, passed back in July. And the House version, which did not include Schumer's amendment because it was the House version, but it did include a like weird parallel amendment written by Burchett, which we'll talk about in a little bit. That also passed. So the House and the Senate both passed the NDAA, but they're different. So they now go into a reconciliation process. There's like a whole formal thing. And of course, given the state of the government and the way everything is going, it's become hugely contentious. And we're talking exclusively about like the UFO angles, but like imagine like aid for Ukraine, the war in Gaza, like all this stuff is part of this debate. There's the usual politics. The part we care about is this like teeny tiny little thing, but that one part has become hotly contested. And over the last 2 weeks, there's been a lot of ground movement on this.
It's wild that this part we care about is even getting discussion considering those other things.
Everything else? Yeah, totally. So yeah, after Thanksgiving, it came out that a group of top House Republicans were working to block the amendment. It was Representative Mike Turner, who represents the district in Ohio that contains Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, which is kind of legendary in UFO circles. Mike Rogers of Alabama, and the two of them got the support of Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell and the new Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson. Which I was telling this to Annie last night, and it reminded me of an article I read recently pointing out that the House of Representatives has 22 committees, and more of those committees are chaired by men named Mike than are chaired by women.
Oh God. It's like, you should have sports team rules. Like if you have the same name as another congressman, you have to have a nickname like Fancy Mike or Sloppy Mike or Spaghetti Mike.
The speaker recognizes Spaghetti Mike on the matter of where we're going to lunch. Please go ahead, sir. Yeah, I love that. I love that for sure. Nicknames all the way around. So yeah, the reasons for their objections were not clear. They've been all over the map. At one point, there was reporting that they were arguing that this review board was too similar to Arrow, and they were demanding that Arrow be defunded first.
Wow. Okay. Hang on. Let me, I feel like I need to get my vintage popcorn maker and like set that up over here and just like have a little popcorn fest.
Yeah, I'm not going to lie. My reaction to them threatening to defund Arrow was, don't threaten me with a good time. Like, I'm thrilled that there's an official UFO office, but it's hard to deny that Arrow has been a bit of a disappointment. You know, and hey, you know, like, it's weird. It turns out if you ask the DOD to investigate whether the DOD has been breaking the law and has any secrets, they might not put their best person on the job.
Yeah, I suppose that's true. You would hope they would, but you know.
So you might remember that the Schumer amendment includes an eminent domain clause that's designed to recover crashed UFOs from private aerospace companies. This is something David Grush talked about, that the U.S. government recovered UFOs and then farmed them out to private corporations for reverse engineering and to conceal them from freedom of information requests and official oversight. Okay,
so like, remind me, eminent domain. The only place I'm used to hearing about that is in like property where a local government can seize, can like force you to sell your house because they need it for whatever. Okay.
Yeah, it's the exact same thing. It says the government has decided that this thing that you're holding is the government's, and you don't have any choice in them.
Yeah. Okay. I seem to recall you talking about Ross Coulthart talking about this. Is that true?
Yeah. So Ross has a legal background, which is hilarious because, you know, he's an investigative journalist, but also he's a lawyer. So
Handy.
he zeroed in on this right away and was saying, this is a legal nightmare. Like, there are going to be court cases out the wazoo the first time the government tries to take something from a corporation.
Yeah.
Because, there's some cases where it's relatively straightforward. Like, okay, let's say in 1950, the US government gave a UFO to Lockheed to study. Now the government comes back and says, you have to give it back to us. Okay, that's relatively clear. But Ross says that his sources tell him that some of these aerospace corporations have recovered UFOs on their own, using their own personnel, their own time, their own money. They've put a lot of research and time into it. And now the government's coming in and saying it's theirs. It's a much messier legal claim.
Yeah, makes sense.
So anyway, Ross has been predicting that, if anything in the Schumer amendment was going to cause problems, it would be the eminent domain bit.
Yeah, I listened to this city planner who said similar. He's like, all these properties have easements that I can put in a like sidewalk or whatever, but I tell you what, it will never happen. So you got to get that sidewalk in from the very beginning.
Yeah, totally. So Liberation Times. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, please.
Liberation Times reported that there were widespread concerns surrounding eminent domain language, posing a risk of aerospace companies losing invaluable materials. It is understood that an alternative mechanism is being proposed to replace this language, allowing the release of materials without necessitating companies to relinquish custody.
That's okay. Like, I'm trying to understand what that means, because like companies can already release materials if they wanted to, and clearly aren't. So like, does this include legal protections, or?
Your guess is as good as mine. Okay. What I'm hearing is the eminent domain clause is a sticking point. So someone is proposing that they water it down. I would be willing to bet the person proposing to water it down is the aerospace companies themselves.
Yeah, I'm sure. Yeah, and I wonder even if they even have UAP, or if they're just like, no, we got to water this down because we don't know where this is going to lead to. Like,
that's totally a fair point, right? And the instant you get lawyers involved, lawyers are going to lawyer, right? Like,
it's so true.
Yeah. Now, you asked me during show prep whether there was an indemnification clause, and it jogged my memory, and Chuck watched me spend a straight 10 minutes trying to find the notes in our own notes. But long story short, no. The reason we were thinking of that is way back in the earlier part of the year, Senator Gillibrand, I believe, had an amendment in the Intelligence Community Authorization Act, which is the same as the NDAA, but for the intelligence community. And that one had a clause that said, government contractors who have UAP materials that they have received from the government have 180 days to turn them over to Aero. And if they do that within 180 days, there will be no legal consequences, which was widely seen as a veiled threat, right? Like, why specify there will be no legal consequences unless there will be legal consequences if you don't do it, even though they don't outline what those might be. But Schumer's amendment doesn't have anything like that in it. It just says straight up, the government has an eminent domain. All your shit is ours now.
Yeah. I kind of forgot about that, and I wonder if anyone did it.
Annie got really upset when I told her about this like eminent domain thing. And what was funny is she wasn't upset about the government taking it. It was more like, why does anyone get to own a crashed UFO? Like, that doesn't make any sense at all. It's not the government's any more than it's Lockheed's. Like, it's not ours. Like, and it gets to, sorry, go ahead.
I was just watching a thing yesterday about how complicated it is to extract like dinosaur bones or treasures from ships, and how they just end up in legal battles for decades.
100%. And we'll talk about this a bit more as the show goes on, but like, there's this awkwardness that the way we have all chosen to talk about UAPs is to avoid mentioning the word aliens. We don't talk about the pilots or who might be behind them. They're unidentified. There's objects in the sky. We should look into them. It's a flight safety thing. But because we never directly acknowledge the idea that they might be piloted by non-human people who have different motivations than us, we never acknowledge that they might have an interest or a concern in it. So it was funny that Annie kind of landed right on this, like, well, it's not ours.
Isn't it the aliens? Don't they get some ownership stake in this?
Yeah, right. Yeah. Like if I crash, my plane into your country, that doesn't mean it's now your plane.
Yeah, right. Yeah, or crash my plane into your ranch doesn't mean you get it now. It's not finders. It's like weird. So finders keepers.
Continuing on the theme of confusion around what exactly the Republicans were objecting to, there was also some confusion around Representative Burchett's separate amendment, and this was in the House version. His was a much more narrowly scoped one that basically just required the DoD to declassify all military knowledge of UAP on a pretty tight timeline. I remember Ross Coulthart being very dismissive of it at the time because it wasn't put up in competition with the Schumer amendment, but because they went in around the same time and dealt with the same subject matter, you kind of can't help but compare them. Anyway, the Republicans were arguing that they are in competition. Like, hey, we've got Burchett in the House saying we should tell the DoD to turn everything over. And then we got Schumer saying all your stuff is belong to us. Well, we're going to go with the Burchett version. And Burchett himself was very clear that he didn't intend his to replace the Schumer amendment. It was meant to supplement it.
Too.
But, of course, there's bad faith arguments being made all around. There was even a bit of... Sorry, go ahead.
This makes me think that like this whole process is like a really complicated Git conflict. And now we've got like two sections that are around the same line, one by Burchett, one by Schumer. And it's like, oh, this is so complicated.
See, and that's why I always resolve all my Git commits by just keeping both versions. It's the only way to be fair.
Both. It's the only way. Yeah. All of our audience just like vomited.
There was also a bit of confusion where Representative Matt Gaetz was trying to argue that Schumer's amendment was bad because it wouldn't release anything for 25 years. He was saying we can't wait 25 years for disclosure, which is not right.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, so, I mean, there was something about 25 years, but that wasn't it, right?
Yeah, what Schumer amendment says is anything that is already 25 years old, meaning up through the year 2000, is supposed to be disclosed immediately. The assumption is that everything will be disclosed within 25 years. It could be disclosed earlier, but it doesn't have to be. But by the time it hits 25 years, the expectation is this is no longer a national secret and can be released. So Gaetz was trying to argue that we wouldn't get anything for 25 years, but it's just a misunderstanding of how it works. We would actually get a huge cache of documents in the first release, which, as we talked about before, might take a year or two for them to get all their ducks in a row. But it's not that we wait 25 years. It's that 25 years from the creation date, it is expected to be declassified.
Got it. And he's wanting this year.
Yeah.
He doesn't get this year for 25 years.
Yeah. So it's confusing, right? Because the UFO community has been going ape for the last 2 weeks, like calling their representatives, everything. And here's Matt Gaetz standing up there with Burchett and Luna and everybody who's saying, like, we want this stuff to happen. And Gaetz is saying we should not pass the Schumer amendment. So it's like, even though Gaetz is like pro-disclosure, he was like landing on the wrong side of this one. It was very confusing. Speaking of
conflicts are hard.
Yeah, speaking of Luna and Burchett, on Thursday, Representative Luna held a press conference with Burchett, Moskowitz, and Gaetz pushing back against the Republicans and against the mics and talking about the need for disclosure.
Which mic, though?
Yeah, the UFO community has been all about like the mics, and it's funny because they refer to the 4 mics, which means they've retroactively labeled Mitch McConnell as one of the mics.
That's awesome.
So yeah, the group that we're used to got up and they said some very encouraging things, indicating that they're going to push back on this. Representative Luna said, I think Schumer's efforts here are probably the floor as to where we would see disclosure begin, which is very encouraging because everybody else was talking about watering it down. She's like, nah, this is the minimum. We're going from here and adding stuff.
Okay.
Representative Burleson said, it is time for Tim's amendment to be passed as well as the Schumer amendment. It's my belief that both of them will put us in a better place.
Sure.
Now, while I was looking into this, do you remember a few episodes ago we were joking about how we needed a nickname for Representatives Burchett and Luna and Moskowitz and all of them?
Yeah, but we couldn't come up with something good. It was like UFO Squad. Or, I don't know.
Or the UFO Gang. Like, none of it felt right. We never actually did. Well, I missed this somehow, but they gave themselves a nickname. Apparently, the official term is the UAP Caucus, and Burchett launched it officially back in August after Grush's testimony, when he and the others wrote a letter to the ICIG requesting information about Grush. They've even got a website at uapcaucus.com.
Hey, all right. So that's okay. Wait, what is a caucus? Hang on, I get it.
I don't know. It's a political thing, right?
Yeah. Okay. All right. GBT says a group within a legislative or decision-making body seeking to represent a specific interest or influence in a particular area of policy. I thought it was just a kind of plant, but maybe I'm thinking of a crocus or something.
A UAP crocus.
There you go.
Excellent. Yes. The UAP crocus stood up and said that we need disclosure now.
Awesome.
An unnamed source with knowledge of the NDAA negotiations said something funny. He said, we've got a problem. Russia or China might beat the United States to disclosing the facts around a non-human intelligence if we don't get our act together fast. This should be motivation enough for the Republican leadership to fight for the UAP Disclosure Act. They should be doing everything in their power to get it passed expeditiously. I'm baffled.
This is a fascinating angle. Like, we can't let the Russians beat us in the disclosure race. We have to disclose faster, harder.
Whoa, phrasing. Yeah, we can't let the Russians beat us to it. Come on, guys. Get your shit together.
I mean, would they even? I don't know. Whatever. If they did, would we believe it? They probably already have.
Who knows, man? So we have talked about Daniel Sheehan a few times on this podcast. He's one of those guys where if you have ever seen a photo of him, he will immediately stick in your mind. I know Chuck is Google image searching him right now. He has this like shocking head of curly white hair. He's a very distinctive person. He's a very serious, distinguished lawyer. He was involved in the Pentagon Papers back in the day. He is Lua Elizondo's lawyer. He has also been neck deep in the UFO topic for a long time. He has his own story about finding secret records in Project Blue Book that he snuck out. Anyway, he has, of course, been deeply involved in the negotiation process. And he has a quote. He said, Mike Turner said, we want the eminent domain provision out of here, and we want the subpoena power out of here. And when our people that were working on this responded to the statute by saying, why would you be so worried about the eminent domain provision if you don't have any of the technology, as you keep insisting? At which point they retreated into an abstract argument on behalf of libertarian values of not having to state, overreach and be able to seize private property.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, I kind of love that the whole thing falls apart immediately when you start poking them a little bit. Why are you opposed to this, Mike? What don't you like about this, Mike? Government.
Yeah, lawyer's gonna lawyer.
Lawyer's gonna lawyer. So anyway, yeah, like I said, about a week ago, it looked really grim. People like Chris Mellon were posting that it was incredibly likely to be axed. He was encouraging everyone to call their representatives and put pressure on them. The vibe was really down, with lots of discussion about what are we going to do when it fails? Not if, but when.
Right.
People like Gary Nolan talked about this being a long-term process, encouraging people to stick with it. People like Daniel Sheehan and Jeremy Corbell strongly implied that they had firsthand witnesses waiting in the wings to go public if it failed. Wow. Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. Freaking do it already. Sounds great.
Right? Yeah. I'm tired of hearing about all these theoretical witnesses. Just they're right over here, but we're going to trust. I get it, right? They want to trust the system. They want the system to work for them, but like, at the same time, like, I don't want to hear any more about these theoretical witnesses. Bring them out, and just do it. Like,
Hashtag get to the aliens.
Yeah. Now, the good news is that since a week ago, the mood has shifted. There's the current state of affair seems to be optimism that the bill will pass, possibly with some modifications, maybe removing the eminent domain. But what Gary Nolan and others have said is the really important part is the review board, right? The JFK style panel that's composed of civilians that are going to look into whether or not things should be declassified. That's the part they're really fighting for. And if I'm being perfectly honest, that's the part I care about. I kind of don't care who owns the UAPs or where they are. If the review board gets together and releases a document saying that the government gave a UFO to Lockheed in the 40s, it kind of doesn't matter whether Lockheed gives it back to the government or not. The word is out, and something is going to happen. So
something's going to happen. Yeah.
Yeah. Now,
I mean, that sounds like a totally hot mess. Stressful, but exciting.
Yeah. I don't know, man. It was, I was really, really bummed last week. It's a good thing we didn't record, because I would have been very morose about the whole thing. But yeah, let's talk about something a little less stressful. Let's talk about why, if you've been involved in the UFO community at all on Twitter or Reddit, you have probably seen people using the phrase catastrophic disclosure.
Oh my God. Yeah. All right. Let's get weird.
All right. So to talk about catastrophic disclosure, we need to start by talking about the Sol Foundation. That's SOL, like our sun.
Okay. I wasn't sure if it was about footwear or the sun. Carry on.
It's funny. I went straight to like the human soul. This is clearly Scott's getting weird.
Sure.
Okay. Let's talk about the soul, Chuck.
I mean, it's weird because I've been watching Lucifer. I should have gone right there, but no, apparently I went to footwear.
So back in August, Dr. Gary Nolan, who is a well-respected Stanford immunologist who we've discussed before, we actually did a whole episode on him. The short version is Gary has a very level head on his shoulder. He has been investigating UFO metamaterials that he got from Jacques Vallée and others. One of the reasons that I have a lot of faith in him is he's not a blind believer in UAP stuff. In fact, Stephen Greer hired him way back in the day to look at his Atacama mummy that he thought was an alien, and Gary Nolan totally debunked it. He's like, no, this thing's totally just a human. Sorry, bro.
That's awesome.
So yeah, I have a lot of faith in Gary. And we've talked about him a lot on the show. Back in August, he formed a new think tank called the Sol Foundation, which was established to research the philosophical, policy, and scientific implications of UAP.
Okay, cool. Who's in it?
So if you go to the website, there's only two people listed. Gary Nolan is listed as
big
the
think tank.
Gary Nolan's listed as the executive director of the board. I would have expected him to have like a C-suite title or something. But Nolan in an interview said that he does not have a line office or a role with the company, since on account of his association with Stanford, he is not allowed to hold a position as the officer of a company outside the university. So but very straightforward. He says he doesn't even draw a salary for this, but he is heavily involved. The other guy is someone I've never heard of before, Dr. Peter Scoffish. He's a sociocultural anthropologist, and his job title is Director of Research. But where this gets interesting... Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, so I read it as scafish, and it didn't bring up any things for me. But when you referred to him as scawfish, I immediately thought about the skankin' pickles, and now I want to like go draw a skankin' fish.
Yeah. Wearing the checkered trousers and
exactly.
So a few other members of the Soul Foundation have been announced. I won't talk about all of them, but the ones that I recognize that I got excited about. Diana Walsh Pasulka, she's an author and a religious studies professor. She wrote a book called American Cosmic that we've talked about before. If you've never read it, highly recommended. She is a board member. Charles McCullough III, who is the former ICIG and David Grush's lawyer, has been announced as their legal counsel. And David Grush himself is listed as a senior founding advisor. We actually found out that Grush was involved in the Soul Foundation because when he testified to Congress, they posted his resume, and on it listed his current job as COO of the Soul Foundation. So that was kind of like when we found out about all this. He has two different job titles, you might have noticed. Gary Nolan was interviewed, and they discussed the title change. He said, "I think you have to understand that at the beginning of setting up any enterprise, everyone wears many hats. And so to the extent that we had to give him a name or a goal or a purpose, that seemed like the right thing at the time. Now he's a senior founding advisor. He is a founder of the Soul Foundation, and each of us have different roles. And as we grow the organization, we'll start to name people into more specific roles as it seems fit." But he was very clear that the COO job title was not a mistake. That was accurate at the time. He was happy about it. It's not a demotion. It's a new organization. They're still filling everything out.
Trying everything out. All right. Yeah. Cool.
From the About page of the Soul Foundation website, which, by the way, I'd totally recommend going and reading. They talk about all of this a lot more elegantly and thoroughly than I can get into in a 5-minute overview here. But there was one paragraph here that I thought kind of summed it up. It says, "The time has come for serious, well-funded, and cutting-edge academic research into the nature of UAP and their broad cosmological and political implications. Such a claim would have been beyond the pale of respectability just 5 years ago, but the U.S. government's recent and continued acknowledgments of UAP have changed them from a subject unworthy of academic consideration into a scientific and intellectual problem of unfathomably broad stakes. Now that UAP are considered real enough by Congress to be addressed with federal legislation, we are forced to consider the broad consequences of this for the future of science, technology, economy, politics, law, religion, culture, and all other human institutions and endeavors."
You said you almost said it right, but you said the line wrong. You got the intonation wrong, because that's almost exactly your line from the beginning.
Now that UAP are considered real.
I think we should absolutely change it and then claim that Gary got it from us all along.
Yeah, totally.
I mean, there's no evidence to the contrary, right?
I mean, obviously, our oldest fan, Mr. Chris Mellon, turned Gary onto the show. We know that they're buddies.
Yeah. It's the only logical conclusion.
Gary Nolan, in an interview with The Debrief, had a great quote. He said, "In a way, I want to make the discussion not only legitimate, but boring. I want to make this an academic discourse, a professional discourse that people can engage in an area where they will not be ridiculed for coming up with an idea. We need to approach UAPs with the same methodology that I do cancer research."
Yes, I love that. I think boring is a fantastic victory condition for this.
Right? Yeah, it reminds me, we talked about this in the earlier Gary Nolan episode, but he had an interview that year when he said that scientists who reject UFOs without considering the evidence are not doing science. And he was really heated about it. And I kind of love seeing him put his money where his mouth is. Like, look, I put my name out there. It hasn't ruined my career. And I've got people coming to me behind the scenes all the time saying, oh my God, you're so brave for doing this. But the whole point is to destigmatize it. Like, if the government is putting UAP disclosure bills into the budget, it's time to get the scientists to pull back a little bit from their instinctive rejection of the idea and start considering the evidence. So I think that's great.
Yeah. Agreed.
Now, the reason we're talking about the Soul Foundation is that on November 17th, they held their first annual symposium at Stanford University. It was an invite-only 2-day event, and it was like a who's who of the UFO field.
Okay. So that I'm slightly offended because that was my birthday and I didn't get an invite.
I'm sure your invitation just got lost in the mail. Yeah.
Maybe. So who was there? I'll send them a reminder card next year. So
good.
They don't forget my birthday.
There were a ton of speakers. I'm not going to list them all, but among the notable ones, Dr. Eric Davis of Wilson Memo fame, Dr. Avi Loeb of the Galileo Project, Leslie Kane from the New York Times story back in 2017, and more recently, the David Grush story. Chris UFO Daddy Mellon, former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense. Dr. Jacques Vallée, who is someone we have not talked about a lot on this show, but he is a freaking legendary figure in the UFO field.
His name came up twice today.
Karl Nell, who is a retired Army Colonel who was a liaison to the UAP task force. If his name sounds familiar, it's because he was one of the sources quoted in the David Grush article who corroborated his claims and also made some of his own. So Nell hasn't gotten as much press as Grush, but he was one of, I think, 2 people in that article who put their name down and said, yes, this stuff is real. So it's interesting that he was publicly speaking here. And they had a secret unannounced speaker.
Oh.
Mr. David Grush himself.
Hey, that's awesome. Was this like one of those now one more things like from the Apple announcement?
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't there, but he was not an announced speaker. He was not on the schedule. But apparently he dialed in via a Zoom call on the second day and gave a little talk, which is awesome.
Yeah, that's great.
Now, they caught a bit of heat for not live streaming the event. Obviously, they had announced it. The speaker list was out there. Everybody knew it was happening. And then they're not live streaming. And the UFO community is just frothing at the mouth. Like, let us see what you're saying. They asked the attendees not to take photos or video. Gary Nolan was on Twitter reassuring people that the event was recorded and they're going to release a professionally edited video. But they just didn't want to turn a serious academic conference into a media circus, which makes a lot of sense, right? Nolan is hosting this at Stanford. A lot of his colleagues from Stanford were there, he confirmed.
Sure.
His goal was to present this information in a hyperbolic way and get people to consider it seriously. And that's hard to do when everybody's got a camera in their face and everything they say is being echoed into the Twitter sphere and, dissected by everything.
Totally makes sense.
Yeah. So I've got a number of quotes here that I'm going to read, just kind of talking about it because a couple of people on Reddit were at the event. So while they weren't able to share, slides or photos or transcripts, they were able to kind of share their recollections and their thoughts. So one of them said, the scientists walked through excellent presentations that showed analysis and findings related to materials, physics, historical info, sensor data, etc. There was not any room for arguments because there wasn't any speculation, only conclusive findings that were evident based on the data they had. So Everin did a really good job of establishing the following. This is what the data says. Here are further questions we have. Also, we need more data, please.
This sounds really cool. I really want it to be there, but also I feel like academics can argue about anything,
Oh,
if
100%.
they really put their minds to it. So
Yeah.
it's impressive that they didn't, that they were just being
Well, it's
respectful.
something Gary's talked about, right? This idea of Gary avoids conclusions. He talks about what he does is present facts,
Yeah.
materials analysis, recordings, radar data.
Mhm.
And then you show these to the other person and you leave it up to them to come to the conclusion. The conclusion may
Yeah.
be very clear to you, but you're not arguing the conclusion. You're arguing the facts, and the facts can't be disputed. This is the data we have on radar. This
Right.
is the spectroscopy of the material recovered, et cetera, et cetera. So,
Yeah.
like you said, you can still have things like Avi Loeb recovering spherals from his meteorite. And, other people will write papers saying that they're actually like coal dust from a common industrial
Yeah, right.
byproduct. There's still room for interpreting the data. But I totally agree with you that this is what we want, right? Like, it's so frustrating to watch everything Congress says. We have to run through this like Kremlinology and like, do they mean what they say? Or, are they double speaking? And seeing scientists just come out and like talk about facts. It's like, it's so refreshing. Like, oh,
so nice.
Wow.
Yeah. Not even alternative facts or anything.
Right. So we mentioned David Grush was the surprise speaker from Zoom. I've got a quote here from him. He said, "Let us advocate for transparency, not for ourselves, but for the generations to come, as we embark on a journey towards a more enlightened and interconnected world."
Love it. Inspirational.
Right?
Was most of his talk inspirational, or did he drop any new info or new facts?
Now, obviously I wasn't there. I don't have a transcript, but based on what I'm seeing on Reddit from the people who were, he didn't say a whole lot that was new. They said he took some questions. He said reverse engineered tech has been integrated into conventional programs, which I think is a new claim. He said there was reverse engineering programs, but this is, I think, taking it a step further where he's saying, yes, they were able to reverse engineer some things and those were put into programs.
Interesting.
Which ties into the speculative history that we read last time from Condor Man about like, what would this look like if there was reverse engineering? How would you seed that out to conventional programs without it being like, hey, here's the UFO tech, So Grush said this is not, the phenomena is not from a single source. And this is something that Darren, Exo Academian, on his podcast, Point of Convergence, talks about all the time. It's a point that I really like. We've talked before about how there are a lot of theories about what UFOs are, right? They might be grays from Alpha Centauri. They might be time travelers from the future. They might be crypto-terrestrials from here on Earth. Like there's, multiverse stuff. What Darren has said and what Grush is now echoing is it's probably not one thing. It's not like, okay, every UFO you see is piloted by a gray. There is one race of aliens and they have come here. Like, if there's one, there's probably more. So I like that idea. It rings true to me that, there would either be nothing or there would be many things. So I find it hard to believe that, there is a single race of aliens visiting us, or that this is just time travelers. It makes more sense to me that there are multiple elements at play here.
Yeah. I'm thinking about like Star Trek and how that plays out. And the only counter argument would be that, that like it's in one alien's territory. We're in one alien's territory or something. But yeah, that makes sense. There'd probably be a lot out there.
Another attendee talked about Chris Mellon, who gave a talk. Chris Mellon spoke about his thought process regarding whether it was responsible to start the avalanche of disclosure. And overall, yes, he thinks it's worth it, but it sounded like he really struggled with the responsibility for pushing disclosure.
Interesting. Like, what about like the responsibility of him personally being
Well,
responsible for
the
that, or
government in total. Now, the good news is, if you're interested in this talk, he turned
yeah.
it into an article. You can read it. It's in our
Oh,
show notes.
fabulous. Okay,
But basically, he outlines the arguments for and against disclosure, specifically from a national security perspective.
sure.
And he has a really funny opening where he talks about, like, I cannot imagine any politician that I've ever worked with being informed about this and told, you can either tell the public about this, which will have consequences. They may be
Yeah,
positive, they may be negative, but like, this is going to be one of the defining things of your term. Or
right,
you can focus on your agenda and leave this unspoken. Like, he's like, I can't
right,
imagine a single politician I worked for like going for that apple. Every single one of them would be like, yeah, no, we've got enough stuff to work on our own.
right. Yeah, it would have to be someone near the end of their career or
Right.
something like that. Someone who wanted
Yeah.
to go out with a bang,
Maybe someone like Joe Biden
or Schumer.
or Schumer. Yeah. There's a quote in the article that I want to read here. He said, because again, like in the UFO community, we've talked before about how it's hard to see disclosure as anything other than a good thing. And we've talked before about the kind of like infantilizing aspect of the government deciding like, oh, there would be panic. The public can't handle the truth. Like, that's not your fucking decision to make, man. But Mellon does a good job of talking about like the broader implications behind that. And we talked, so he says, what if disclosure precipitated a change in the behavior of an alien civilization, given that they no longer had an incentive to remain elusive and clandestine? What is the risk potential that disclosure might cause some governments to overreact, precipitating fearful and aggressive interactions? If these risks are substantial, does it still make sense to release such disruptive information?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like the simpler version of this is like, if someone broke into your house, do you want them to know you're awake? In which case they might go away, or do you want them to think you're asleep while you're calling for backup, like the police, so they might get caught in the act? And they're like,
Yeah, totally. Well, and that math is complicated enough when you're dealing with humans who
Right.
broadly operate the same way that we do. If we're talking
Yeah.
about aliens, like we have to resist the temptation to anthropomorphize them.
Oh god.
Are they being secretive because they have something to hide? Or are they being secretive because they don't register us or whatever?
Yeah.
Like, so we don't know what are the risks inherent in disclosing that we know that they know that we know.
What a mess.
It is a mess. But it gets back to what we were talking about before, right? That in a weird way, it's kind of refreshing to see someone come out and talk about like, hey,
Right.
if it's aliens, part of the discussion has to be, what are the aliens going to do? How do they feel about it? What is their reaction going to be? You can't just ignore that if you're
Right.
doing a risk analysis.
Yeah, especially since we've been stealing their ships for a while.
Apparently, right? Close to the end of the day, Hal Puthoff spoke. Now, we've talked briefly about Hal Puthoff before. He is to be fair, controversial scientist who has been involved in remote viewing experiments at the Stanford Research Institute. He helped found To the Stars Academy with Tom DeLonge. He's been deeply involved in the UFO stuff for a while, and especially involved in like the kind of paranormal experimentation side back in the 70s. All the, what was that movie? The Men Who Stare at Goats, Project Stargate, all that kind of stuff. Like that was, as I understand it, Hal Puthoff. So yeah, he's a little controversial, but he's been involved in the community, and he told a story about his history with disclosure. So he said that in 2004, he was invited to a conference, but the person would not tell him what it was about, just that he would be very happy if he went. So he decided to go, and right. And when he arrived, he saw some familiar faces from the CIA, the DIA, and the military, as well as some unfamiliar faces. about 20 people total. The leader of the meeting said, assume that the US, Russia, and China all have recovered craft that they are reverse engineering. And this group was brought together to consider the implications of disclosure. So as a group, they started listing in as much detail as they could all the potential effects from disclosure. For example, if company A had tech that the government provided that they reverse engineered, company B might sue them and the government for an unfair advantage. The stock market would go crazy. There would be impact on various religions and on down the line. Once they got to a full list that they all agreed on, they split into 4 groups, and each of them ranked a quarter of the list from -9 to 9, depending on if they thought the effect would be a net positive or negative. And even though most of the participants said they were pro-disclosure leading into the meeting, every group ended up with a negative number total. So the group recommended against disclosure.
Yeah, I 100% believe it, at both that it happened and the outcome. But I also think this is where you have to fall back on core values. Transparency and honesty are hard. And but I just don't like living without those, even if it feels necessary.
Yeah, it reminds me of when people point out that, like, if you are afraid of dying, like, you take a risk every time you step outside your front door. You could be run over by a bus. You could catch COVID. You could get food poisoning. Like, unless you're going to go full Howard Hughes, like, there's no way to isolate yourself from risk. So everything we do carries risk. And if you get trapped in this risk analysis mindset, it's really easy to get sucked into overvaluing the danger of all of the risks compared to the benefits of coming forward. And you'll notice, he, as far as I can tell, he only listed negative examples, but there are positive impacts that could come out. Maybe they considered them. I don't know. But, like, for example, one of the things we hear often from David Grush and others is the technology they're sitting on that they're trying to reverse engineer has huge potentials for the human race. Clean energy, environmental effects, power generation alone could make massive differences in the world. And they have been, by virtue of secrecy, stovepiping this to a degree that they're operating with one hand tied behind their back. They cannot research this to the degree that you would like. So a positive aspect of disclosure would be allowing proper full steam ahead research into these, literally earth-changing technologies if they exist.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
All right. So we're getting to the point here, I swear. Our last attendee we're going to talk about is Karl Nell. So Karl Nell presented a dense DoD-style set of slides explaining the thought process behind the design of the Schumer Amendment, including the political reality and the purpose of the legislation and the definitions and use of the terms NHI in the bill. And in this, he called for a UAP campaign plan to compel transparency, as well as a Manhattan Project to successfully reverse engineer recovered UAP craft. And he said he wanted transparency on covert UAP programs on or before the conclusion of the decade.
Okay.
Now, I talked before about how no one was supposed to take any photos or anything. But one photo did leak. Someone took a photo of Karl Nell talking, and it's taken at an angle from the side. So there's this like trapezoid in the photo of his slide. And someone, of course, extracted it out and distorted it back to be able to read it. And it was all anyone was talking about for a day or two. And it is a really interesting slide showing a potential timeline for disclosure with milestones through 2034. But yeah, it caused a lot of hubbub, as you can imagine.
Yeah. Wow. So 2034, like, 10 more years is what they're thinking?
Yeah, that's what people were reacting to. As you can imagine, people
Okay.
are like, I don't want to wait
Yeah.
10 years. I want it now.
Yeah.
There was one comment that I appreciated, which is, this is not a plan for disclosure. It
Mm.
is a plan for researchers to figure out what UAP are and be able to demonstrate that they
Oh.
exist, not to the public, but scientifically, which is the normal demonstration phase found in the scientific model. And again,
Yeah.
knowing the audience he was speaking to,
Yeah.
the context makes it a little more clear.
Yeah. Okay, that
So
makes sense.
I'm going to talk a bit about this slide. I'm going to do my best to describe what's on it, but it's in the show notes. Please feel free to go click on it, because obviously I can only do so good a job visually, verbally describing a visual slide.
Yeah.
But basically the slide shows 5 phases of this disclosure plan. Actually, there's 6 phases, but one of them is phase 0, which he labeled shaping, and it's marked as complete. And listed under there is NIDS, OSAP, ATIP,
Awesome.
the New York Times article, the UAP task force, etc. Basically, all the UFO history stuff that we've been talking about since 2017, he kind of like lumps in to be like the foundation of this disclosure plan.
Yeah, that makes sense. Is the last phase profit?
No, it is not. Well, yeah, maybe. One of the lines is private industry. So phase 1 is called demonstrate existence, and it was targeted for January 2024, which is basically today. He had it marked as on target. So starting at phase 1 and extending through the following phases are these 4 parallel lines of effort, which are spread across 4 sectors: government, philosophy, science, and private sector. So kind of like Gary Nolan was talking about, like, you need to consider the impact of UAP not just on science, but also on religion. How do we exist as a society? How does it impact private industry? How does it affect the government? So he's kind of broken it down into categories and how they will dig into it. He has some bits at the bottom kind of describing each phase and how they're different from the previous phases. So he says phase 1, the approach is reactive and involves generating hypotheses, with the objective being government acceptance.
I gotta say, government acceptance by January 2024 feels a little ambitious. Like, I know there's debate and it's in official discussions. It's not laughed out of the room, but acceptance?
Yeah, acceptance is a complicated word, and I'll talk about this a little more later, but it's important to remember we don't have the context for this slide. We got a photo of the slide with no explanation. So what does he mean by acceptance?
Right.
If he says we're on target for government acceptance by January 2024, I interpret that to mean what we've talked about before, which is it is a huge milestone that the topic of UAP doesn't get laughed out of the room anymore. We've got the most powerful Democrat in Congress fronting a bill called the UAP Disclosure Bill, which talks about secret programs, that talks about illegal cover-ups. We've got congressional hearings. We've got, lots of attention on this topic. And it's not just fringe politicians or junior people like Burchett, like high-level people like Gillibrand and Marco Rubio and Senator Schumer are talking about this all the time. So I don't think acceptance necessarily means 100%. It doesn't mean every single person in the room believes these are alien. It means we've gotten to the point where the topic is capable of being discussed in a rational manner. And I think we're basically there.
Yeah, I think you're right. Okay.
Phase 2 was listed as correlate signatures, and it was targeted for January 2025, so basically a year from now. And it shows continued effort across all 4 of those lines of effort, with the approach shifting to be more persistent and forensic, and the stated objective is academic acceptance.
Okay. So again, 1 year to get academic acceptance seems fast, but I remember XKCD did a comic that was
Mhm.
like, um, do you know how fast I would turn around if someone showed me evidence of this stuff?
Yeah.
And maybe, I mean, I don't know, nerds are going to nerd.
Well,
So,
and this is what the Soul Foundation is for, right? This is what the
yeah,
Galileo Project is
yeah,
for.
totally.
These are two big name scientists who are kind of staking their reputation on the line, saying, this isn't fringe science. This is
Right.
science. We should be looking at this and taking it seriously. And that means leaving our biases at the door and examining it fairly. I agree.
Yeah.
A year seems ambitious. you know, my current if I kind of take the temperature of the scientific community is, you still have mostly people like Neil deGrasse Tyson who are just immediately hand wave the topic away. Yes,
Yeah.
alien life statistically must exist out there, but it is virtually impossible for them to be able to come here because of the speed of light, and just immediately rejecting the proposition.
Right.
And if you have immediately rejected the proposition, then maybe there are unidentified things in the sky, but they must be prosaic by definition. So it starts you off, as Gary Nolan said, in a very
Right.
unscientific place. So
Right.
it feels aggressive to me, but maybe, Gary's really going to do a great job. And, at next year's anniversary, we'll look back and go, man, I can't believe a year ago we thought that it would be hard to get scientists on board. Now it's all
Right.
they'll talk about. We can't get them to stop
Yeah.
talking about aliens.
Yeah, I could see it. If we can get a couple of those people like Neil deGrasse Tyson or Bill Nye on board, like,
Yeah.
I don't know, maybe it wouldn't be too hard.
So phase 3 is listed as characterized performance, which is targeted at October 2030. So we're jumping a little further forward
jump.
now.
Yeah.
Big jump. Shows government effort ending at a decision point. We don't have the context to know what the decision point is. I am assuming the decision point is, does the president get up in front of the nation and say, this is real?
Mm.
I don't know. But he shows the approach shifting to be proactive and predictive. And I assume that means we're getting out of the reactive phase of we're looking for UFOs, and when we see them, we take notes, and to more, we're able to kind of predict, oh, we see them around here. We know certain things herald their arrival. We know how to detect them reliably on radar, that kind of shit.
Right.
And he's listed the objective of this phase as public acceptance.
So public acceptance in 7 years. I mean, I guess it took you about a year to get me on board, but I was kind of open, and we've spent a lot of time talking about it.
We have. You got the fast track.
Yeah, right. So if it takes a year on the fast track, maybe 7 years is the right amount. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, and just like we just talked about with academics, like what is the Soul Foundation going to do? The question of public acceptance is going to depend wildly on how this material is presented to the public. So far, we're still dealing with a lot of stigma around the topic. We've mostly moved out of the X-Files music played every time the news talks about UAP, but we're still basically there. 7 years from now, maybe this is kind of a common topic of conversation, and that stigma has erased. If the public is exposed to this on a more frequent basis with a more serious tone, I could see people coming around to it. Because right now, honestly, a lot of it is when I talk to people and tell them I have a UFO podcast, people who would never have brought up the topic with me, once they find out I'm open to it, are interested to talk about it. They're not necessarily converts. They're not necessarily sold. But I think there is way more stigma in the academic world than there is in the general public. I think the general public has been trained to think it's a joke, but could come around if they saw more people taking it seriously and talking about it openly.
Yeah. Are you sure that those people aren't just trying to determine if you're dangerous?
They might be. Who knows? Yeah. They were backing away slowly.
I mean, I love your hopeful perspective, but
So phase 4 is determine nature. This is highlighted for October 2034, and it was marked as after disclosure with 3 question marks. I don't know what
okay.
that means, but again, that
Sure.
kind of brings me back to the previous one ended with a decision point. So I think this
Mhm.
is saying like after disclosure means at the decision point, we made the decision to disclose, and now this is what do we
Right.
do post disclosure. Um,
Got it.
so he shows the approach shifting to targeted and integrated, with the object being 5 W's answered. So
Hmm.
he's saying 10 years from now, we should know the who, what, when, where, why about UFOs. And I don't know, like 10 years, like when we started, I was like, 10 years, that's ridiculous. But once we actually sit down and start talking about it in the context of how long does it take to get
Yeah.
to not just public acceptance of it, but we know all the answers about it. We know the who, what, when, where, why about this. Maybe
Maybe.
and it kind of comes back to I think it was unfortunate this was labeled as a disclosure timeline, because I think a
Mm.
better take would be this is a timeline to public acceptance. And
Mm.
if you view it that way, 10 years feels
Sure.
reasonable, maybe even aggressive.
Yeah. I mean, there's some pretty big gaps in time in there,
Mhm.
and but at the same time, like the tech and scientific advances feel like almost too short
Yeah.
to happen in 10 years. So
Mhm.
feels feels actually, yeah, quite ambitious for 10 years, but which is
Mhm.
a little disappointing to be confronted with that. But I've been maintaining super AI was going to happen in 2030 anyway, so maybe that's going to speed everything up.
There you go. I mean, that's the thing, right? Like the further out you start prognosticating, the
Mhm.
more hazy it has to become, because so many
Yeah.
things could change. Um,
Yeah.
Saying government acceptance by the end of this year, yeah, feels reasonable.
Yeah.
Saying scientific acceptance by a year or two from now, if the cards fall right, maybe. Public acceptance by 10 years from now. There's so many things that could
Yeah.
change between then and now.
Right.
Maybe that's totally reasonable. Maybe it's totally slow. Maybe it's totally fast. It all depends on how every other part of this goes. Um,
Right. Yeah.
so the final phase was engagement. It had no date
Perfect.
associated with it, but it showed the approach shifting to interactive and scientific discoveries with the objective of the strategic endpoint. Um, so
Okay.
again, if I can kind of summarize what he's saying here, we'll talk about the endpoint in a second. He's kind of saying like, this is the steps that kind of need to happen to get us to a disclosure point with general acceptance, and to get us beyond debating about whether this is real and getting into real research and science being done. So he says the strategic end state of all of the lines of effort has 3 items: proper oversight restored. So,
Okay.
right now, all this stuff is kind of
Yeah.
being illegally hidden. We're breaking the laws. Government
Right.
isn't involved in oversight. Um, 2, scientific understanding advanced. Okay, makes sense. And
Yeah.
catastrophic disclosure avoided.
Right. I forgot what we were working towards.
Right?
Okay, so what is that?
What is catastrophic disclosure? So I don't actually know, but
Okay.
this has been a hot topic. Everyone has been
Okay.
talking about catastrophic disclosure. Someone posted and said they attributed this quote to Karl Nell. I don't know if it's an
Okay.
actual quote. I don't know if it's a verbatim, but to give a little context, he said catastrophic disclosure is all the information being dumped out there by an adversary or non-human intelligence with the purpose of creating societal disruption.
Okay. Yeah, and adversary includes like
Russia,
Elon Musk,
China.
right?
Yeah, Elon, right? Like, but yeah, basically someone going rogue and just throwing
Yeah.
everything out there. And all these considerations we've been talking about, like what what is the downside of disclosure? Chris Mellon talking about the national security implication, Hal Puthoff talking about the cultural implications, the legal implications.
Right.
Catastrophic disclosure is basically putting it all out there without having time to acclimate the public to it. And Gary Nolan had a really excellent point about this in a recent interview. He said, I don't think what the people behind the scenes, meaning like the government, the DOD, the secret keeper, I don't think what the people behind the scenes realize is that the frustration that's boiling over, even from people inside, is just going to cause a form of disclosure that is uncontrolled. Sure. A lot of things can go wrong if the information is put out in the wrong way. So what Karl was doing is he was trying to prepare the instruments of power, the instruments of government and society in a careful way to accept the information more readily. And it was 8 to 10 years or something like that. And some people didn't like that and said, oh, that's ridiculous. It should be done immediately. But it doesn't need to be done immediately. It needs to be done carefully. And that means you have to prepare the ground.
Yeah, I do agree with that to some degree. But there's also, I've been reading articles recently about privileged info, and one that I ran across was about how people with privileged information believe there's more detriment than there turns out to be in releasing it. So I understand why it feels this way, but I want to rely on our government to be a little bolder. Even if, frankly, U.S. citizens regularly give them reason to believe that we can't handle it.
Totally. Well, and, it also comes back to, as much as we're trying to be charitable here, there is also an angle here that we have talked about before, which is if you are a secret keeper who has done illegal things to keep the secret, there is literally no advantage to the secret coming out for you. There could be very real legal consequences. So unless we do something like an amnesty or a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, it makes perfect sense that some of these gatekeepers would be very resistant putting it out there. Not in the sense of a mustache-twirling villain trying to retain their power, but just in a practical self-protection stance. Like, this is only bad for me. Whether it's good for society or not, I'm going to prison.
I get it.
So anyway, catastrophic disclosure. That was the buzzword of the week. We had to go on a bit of a journey to get there with the foundation of the Soul Foundation, the formation of the Soul Foundation, and their conference, and all the people who were talking. And of course, it is worth remembering that everything I said to you about this is based on, a handful of people who attended the conference putting out little synopses on Reddit and Twitter. I can't wait for the real videos to come out. There's no timeline on that. Who knows when it's going to happen? But if there's anybody in this field that I have faith in presenting information in a thoughtful, considered way, it's Gary Nolan. So I'm willing to wait a little bit and trust that he's going to put it out in a good way. And let me tell you, when that comes out, that's when I'm going to be getting out the popcorn, and we're certainly going to have an episode dedicated to what they actually said at the Soul Foundation. Yeah, maybe. Maybe.
Yeah. All right. Sounds good.
Sounds good. All right. Well, thank you for joining us on It's a Very Exciting Time. You can find show notes and more on our website, veryexcitingtime.com, as well as links to our social media accounts.
And feel free to email us at Scott or Chuck at veryexcitingtime.com. And if you'd like to support the show, please check out our Patreon at patreon.com/veryexcitingtime.
Yep. And Chuck, as always, my wife thanks you for listening to me talk about UFOs so she doesn't have to.